office. Our friends are strong, our enemies are weak, and there's a genuine opportunities for a new future.
I don't believe in coincidences. And so I do believe President Trump had an impact on this deal.
You'd be willing to resign if ordered to do something improper.
I wouldn't be Attorney General if anyone asked me to do something improper.
I think you're the perfect pick at one of the most dangerous times in American history, and I look forward to supporting you.
Hello, I'm Caitlin Huey-Burns in Washington. Tonight on America Decides, deal reached. From Tel Aviv to Gaza, people gather as the Middle East moves a step closer to peace. The ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas and the role that the Biden and Trump officials played in making it happen.
There was no other way for this war to end than with a hostage deal. And I'm deeply satisfied this day has finally come.
President Biden will take to the airwaves again tonight for a primetime address from the White House, capping a 5-decade political career. And from Florida into the fray, Trump's cabinet pick for Secretary of State Marco Rubio, the senator from Florida, and Attorney General nominee Pam Bondi both faced Senate confirmation hearings. Tonight, we start with CBS News Chief Foreign Affairs correspondent Margaret Brennan for the latest on the ceasefire agreement. Margaret, thank you for being here. I know you've been reporting on this all day, talking to all the officials involved. I want to talk about the implementation of this in a moment, but let's first start with what exactly this deal is and really how it came together.
Well, everything really came together within the last 96 hours. But this goes back to the framework that President Biden stood up and laid out publicly in May, at the end of May. So that's been floating out there. But the momentum behind the diplomacy really happened after the election. President Biden, for him, foreign policy is a huge part of his legacy, and he wanted to get a ceasefire deal. He deployed his diplomats to the region, both to get a ceasefire in Lebanon and also to push on the hostages. All of this started picking up momentum very recently. Brett McGurk is the top White House advisor to Joe Biden. He sent him to Doha, and he's been there for weeks. Within the last 96 hours or so, Donald Trump, the president-elect, sent his envoy, Steve Witkoff, to be really working with him arm in arm. A senior administration official was briefing reporters earlier today and said the origins of that partnership really came out of that Oval Office meeting between President Biden and President-elect Trump recently, where he said it's in the interest of the country to get this peace deal help support here. It's to show that there can't be a fissure that could be exploited by Hamas or Israel there. Long story short, fast forward to what came together within the last few hours. And there were some 11th hour hiccups, but ultimately this was announced.
You know, it's interesting that we saw these two teams working together seemingly so seamlessly. I mean, Witkoff was telling us at Mar-a-Lago last week, you know, he was praising the Biden administration for bringing him in. But he also said that he thought that Trump deserved, you know, his persistence here and his persona, in his words, really helped to drive these negotiations. And I'm curious if there is any truth to that, if Trump does deserve some of the credit here.
Well, in terms of the structure of the diplomacy, the details, the sequencing, all that work, that was diplomats for months and weeks, right? And so it was sort of the closing element where I'm told by my sources that Steve Witkoff really became very useful. And the threat of Donald Trump coming to office became useful, particularly to the more and more right-wing Israeli government. For Benjamin Netanyahu to hear, after defying Joe Biden for the better part of the past year and a half, that Donald Trump actually wants him to do something. And to have him send his envoy from Florida to Israel, as he did over the weekend, to get that message, was received differently. And for Hamas, they've been under increased pressure as well. Don't forget the other element. Yahya Sinwar, the architect of that horrific attack on October 7th, is off the battlefield. There have been dynamics in this conflict that have changed dramatically. It's his brother who accepted this deal, and he was strong-armed into it by Egypt and Qatar. But the dynamic on the ground has changed. The closing element of having Donald Trump say, I want this too, really did help.
Apply the pressure. And then, you know, obviously we have the deal. Implementing it is a whole other story. What are the kind of complications or challenges ahead for this?
Well, just tomorrow in Cairo, Egypt, they will have an implementation meeting to talk through the very difficult part of seeing this through. So an agreement on paper, it's only worth the paper it's written on, right? It has to, you have to see people follow through with it. Also within Israel, you have the political dynamic that is very complicated. The prime minister under increased pressure from within his right wing. Just within the past few days, some members of his coalition have threatened to collapse his government if he agreed to a peace deal, because they are from that element within Israel that believe Gaza should not be under Palestinian control, but rather should be annexed, who don't want to give an inch. You have the left wanting the hostages back and just an end to the fighting. So Benjamin Netanyahu's in the middle of this and ultimately came to the agreement, but the process is still not certain. He has to get this deal approved by his cabinet, by the Knesset, their version of a parliament, and we may see some legal challenges, I'm told by my sources, in the coming days, particularly when that list of Palestinian prisoners who will be released, hundreds of them from Israeli detention centers, that may go through some legal challenges. But it was all signed off on by the Israeli security cabinet.
All right, a lot to look forward. Good news, but we'll see how it gets implemented. Margaret Brennan,
very big deal.
A very big deal. Thank you very much for your reporting. We appreciate it. White House National Security Communications Advisor John Kirby is with us now. Mr. Kirby, great to see you. Thank you so much for being here. This is all, of course, fantastic news. I'm curious, though, how confident are you that both sides will be able to abide by this agreement? Because implementation of this will be the challenge.
Yeah, you're right. Now comes the real hard work of putting the modalities of the plan in place and executing to it over the course of the weeks and months ahead. And that's going to be tough work. The president said today that he's confident it can and will be implemented. And he knows, because we've been in touch with the incoming Trump team, how seriously they're taking this. They know that they're now going to be responsible for implementation, which is why we wanted them informed from the very, very beginning of what was being negotiated. And we're confident that they certainly have the experience and the wisdom now. They certainly know enough about the deal that they can carry it through. And obviously, it's going to require commitments by all sides, by the Israelis, by Hamas, certainly our partners in the region who will be also monitoring implementation. A lot of hard work ahead, but we're confident that it can be done.
And there are Americans, of course, being held hostage as well. Do we know how many Americans are going to be released? When will we see them returned?
Well, I don't want to get into too much detail at this time as we work out these final steps towards implementation starting this weekend. But we do know that there will be Americans, more than one, in the first tranche that come out. And again, I want to stress that the first tranche is going to be focused on women, the elderly, the sick, the injured, the most at risk. And so we know that there are Americans in that group, but it won't be all of the Americans in that group. So, but we can say for sure that some Americans will come out in this first tranche.
That is great news. And I want to ask, because you mentioned, obviously, President-elect Trump will be president once the ceasefire has ended. So they've been part of this negotiation for a while now. We saw that Trump's Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, was in Doha working on these negotiations. How much credit do you think that Trump should get for this successful negotiation?
Well, first of all, I would hope we would all move beyond the question of who gets credit. I mean, I don't think that the hostages are caring about that, and I don't think their families care about that. I don't think the Palestinians in Gaza care about who gets credit for this. The truth is that there's a lot of credit to go around, including in the region. Prime Minister Netanyahu, who had made some courageous decisions, Egyptians, the Qataris, and certainly here in the United States. It's important to remember that this deal was the deal that President Biden negotiated and put on the table back in May, got international support for it. That's the deal that we're talking about being implemented here coming forward, and it was due to a lot of intense diplomacy by American diplomats since May to now. It also was a result of the work that the IDF did to decimate Hamas's military power and put them in such a position of weakness, them and Iran, that there was no support for Hamas moving forward. Hamas knew it had to deal. And that was a result, again, of work by the IDF and with our support to make it harder for Hamas. But clearly, and the president talked about this today, we approach these negotiations as one team. Once President-elect Trump won the election, the president directed us, our team, to reach out to them to make sure that they were fully informed and were coordinated with and involved. And Mr. Witkoff was involved in discussions in the region, in Doha and in Tel Aviv, because we know, President knew, that it was going to be up to Mr. Witkoff and the Trump team to implement this. We just talked about how hard it's going to be to implement or how much work there's going to need to be done. Need to make sure that they were fully informed so they could do that.
And the Qatari prime minister complimented that collaboration as influential. You mentioned Hamas, because Biden did say today that the people of Gaza can look forward to a future without Hamas. But what's your assessment of their current state within the Middle East right now?
They're much weaker, Hamas is, than they've ever been before. Again, Sinwar is dead. The leader, the one who decided to launch those dastardly attacks on the 7th of October. Their other leaders at all kinds of levels in their chains of command have been taken off the battlefield. Infrastructure's been destroyed. Tunnels absolutely flattened. No ability to continue to recruit the kind of fighters that they want. Militarily, they are a spent force, and they are dramatically weaker, which is why we believe they were more willing to deal now. Of course, they're also more isolated. It's not just Hamas that's weaker. Iran is weaker than it's ever been before. Hezbollah wasn't going to come to the rescue of Hamas because the United States brokered a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah. And Hamas, they could see the writing on the wall. They could see they had really nowhere else to go.
All right, well, we will, of course, stay tuned as this becomes implemented, and looking forward, hopefully, to some good news this weekend for those families. John Kirby, thank you so much. It was great to see you.
Yes, ma'am. You too.
Now to Capitol Hill, where today senators questioned several nominees for key posts in President-elect Trump's incoming administration, including his Attorney General pick, Pam Bondi, and his Secretary of State pick, Senator Marco Rubio. Nicole Killian joins us now from Capitol Hill. Nicole, good to see you. I know it's been a busy day up there, a lot of nominees getting through these committees. I do want to start with Pam Bondi. I know you spoke with some senators about the Attorney General nominee today. What did they have to say? What's the reaction? Do you think she'll get through?
Yeah, well, just to be clear, we were talking about 6 confirmation hearings, all almost happening at the same time. But yes, most of the attention was focused on Attorney General designate Pam Bondi, the Attorney General from Florida, or former Attorney General from Florida, who by and large received a pretty welcome reception from senators, but certainly a lot of tough questioning on the part of Democrats as to whether or not she would maintain her independence from the incoming president, which is something that she said that she would run the Justice Department independently. Take a listen to both Democrats and Republicans that I talked to about some of their takeaways and concerns.
The bigger question is she prepared to risk her job as Attorney General to say no to Donald Trump? 2 of his attorneys general who said no were fired on the spot. And she has to tell us that she's going to hold the law and the Constitution above the president.
Is there anything that would compel you to support her confirmation?
No, I'm not coming in here with prejudice against her in any respect. But I do think that's a legitimate question based on what happened in Donald Trump's first term.
So you don't expect any retribution on her part or the part of the president-elect?
Well, I think there ought to be accountability. We'll see what she says. The American people don't deserve to have one of the most powerful people in government going after their political enemies like you see in some third world banana republic.
Now, again, Bondi reiterated that she would follow the law, follow the facts, and that, again, she would maintain her independence from President-elect Trump. She also said politics wouldn't necessarily play a role in the Justice Department. That being said, she was also asked about January 6 pardons, potentially prosecuting members of the January 6 Select Committee. She declined to comment there. She was also pressed about the 2020 election as well and whether or not she accepted the results. So there were a lot of touch points there, but most interestingly, a lot of the questions weren't necessarily centered on Bondi, but also Kash Patel, the president-elect's pick for FBI director. A confirmation hearing has yet to be scheduled for him, but we did happen to catch Kash Patel in the halls along with Senator Tom Tillis. Take a listen to that exchange.
Number one, the Democrats are out of material for Pam Bondi if they're spending time talking about Kash Patel. And number two, they're weaving a false narrative that when he comes before the nomination hearing, we'll be busted. Media's going to have to come up with a new way to define him.
So Patel declined to respond to our questions when I asked what he made of the fact that his name kept being brought up over and over during Pam Bondi's hearing. But that being said, certainly there are a lot of questions on the part of Democrats about how he may run the FBI potentially if he were confirmed, if he's going to do away with it. Is he going to pursue enemies on his so-called enemy list, which he has talked about before? Those were also moments that came up during the hearing, with some senators calling on Pam Bondi to disavow some of the comments that Kash Patel has made. But she stood by him, saying that he was a career attorney and a public defender, someone very familiar with intelligence. So for now, she is standing by him, as is President-elect Donald Trump.
His confirmation hearing will be something to stay tuned for indeed. Nicole Killian, you are everywhere around Capitol Hill following all of this for us. We appreciate it. Thanks so much. And President Biden's farewell speech, the primetime address as a ceasefire deal is reached between Israel and Hamas. Our Nancy Cordes and Weijia Jiang are standing by to break it all down. You're watching America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. President-elect Trump is taking credit for the ceasefire and hostage deal in the Middle East. He says the agreement only could have happened as a result of his win in November. This despite the fact that the White House has been working on this for months. President Biden was asked about who should take credit.
Thank you.
Folks, credit for this, Mr. President, you or Trump?
Is that a joke?
Weijia Jiang and Nancy Cordes join us now. Nancy, I want to start with you because you're in West Palm Beach, where the president-elect's transition is happening. We heard just a week ago Trump say at Mar-a-Lago that there would be hell to pay if a deal was not reached before he took office on January 20th. Can you kind of walk us through how closely Trump's team was in working with the Biden team in getting this negotiation done?
Great to see you, Caitlin. Yeah, they worked hand in hand. As soon as Trump was declared the winner of the 2024 election, his people and then eventually his designated Middle East envoy, Stephen Witkoff, was brought into the fold, was kept abreast of what was going on in the negotiations, and eventually he began to participate in the negotiations himself, even traveling to the Middle East to meet with the Israeli prime minister. You can understand why, from the Biden team's perspective, they would want to get buy-in from the Trump team. There are so many examples throughout history of diplomatic negotiations falling apart because one side of the deal said, you know, if we just wait you out, maybe the next administration will have a deal that's more favorable for us. And that's something that the Biden team knew was quite possible once Joe Biden was a lame duck, and knowing that Donald Trump, who has a closer relationship in many ways with Netanyahu than he does, was set to take office in January. So they decided to handle this as a unit. Witkoff, who doesn't have any diplomatic background, he has done a lot of real estate deals. He's a businessman. He's very close to Donald Trump. They golf together. Sort of a hard-nosed negotiator, got involved. And so I do think that when you look at the situation and the fact that this is a deal that was more or less out there on the table, right for the picking for the better part of a year, the fact that it is getting done now is a sign that at the very least the leaders of both Israel and Hamas were aware of where the next president wanted this to go and what he might possibly do if they didn't sign on the dotted line.
Yeah, I mean, Nancy and Weijia, I think this collaboration is so fascinating because it's not something that we have seen between these two teams before, and kind of the idea that a hostage deal was just such a goal for both of them. Weijia, I know the president talked about this today. He's expected to talk about it later today, perhaps in his farewell address. He was saying how they have worked for months, acknowledged that these two teams work together. Here's a little bit of what he had to say after this deal came together.
This deal was developed and negotiated under my administration, but its terms will be implemented, for the most part, by the next administration. In these past few days, we've been speaking as one team.
So I mean, he's acknowledging the reality that Trump will be president once the ceasefire has ended. But what do you make of the way he framed this today?
Well, he, of course, wants the credit for hashing out the details of this deal. He wants his team to be recognized. In fact, he named all of them because they have been going to and from the Middle East for months now, trying to get this over the finish line. But he has to acknowledge, and he did, that it really is just passing the baton, because the real finish line is going to be if and when the deal is implemented in all three of its phases. But when he was directly asked about Trump's comments taking credit, he said, you know, this was my deal. This was exact my framework that I put forward back in May, which is true, the details of it and how it would be carried out. But in terms of the practical sense, it is up to the incoming Trump administration. And that is why, he said they have been working so closely together, and that they really have to speak in one voice, because this is not about a Biden or a Trump administration. This is about the United States and America playing such a key role in getting this done, to bring hostages home and to end the fighting in Gaza. And that is what he is trying to stress above all the political rhetoric.
Yeah, a rare moment of transcending politics, and we will see, and we're grateful for those families who hopefully will have some good news soon. Weijia Jiang and Nancy Cordes, thank you so much for your time. Democrats take aim at Pete Hegseth's qualifications as he vies to become the next Secretary of Defense. We'll take a closer look at his credentials next on America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Democratic and Republican senators sparred over whether Pete Hegseth is qualified for Secretary of Defense during his confirmation hearing. Senior fellow for the University of Southern California's Annenberg Center on Communication and Leadership and Policy, Barbara Starr, joins us now. She's also, of course, former CNN Pentagon correspondent. Barbara, great to see you. Thank you so much for being here. You are the perfect person to talk to because you know better than anyone how the Pentagon operates. Can you give us a scope? I want to talk about Hegseth in a minute, but can you give us the scope of this job? I mean, this is one of the most powerful positions, if not the most powerful position in the cabinet.
24/7, 7 days a week, all the time, because every Secretary of Defense will tell you they never know when they're going to get that 3 a.m. phone call, which can come at high noon, which can come anytime. And suddenly, in an instant, not only is it the national security of the United States, the safety of the American people, the safety of American troops abroad, but the instant need to advise a president of the United States on the best options forward in an instantaneous crisis. And sadly and tragically, they continue to happen. Bad stuff happens around the world. We all certainly hope it doesn't in the next 4 years, but the chances are it will. And Mr. Hegseth will have to be on his toes at all times, even in the middle of the night when the phone rings beside his bed.
And it was interesting because, you know, the chairman of the committee acknowledged at the outset that this is an unconventional nominee, but he also said, Chairman Wicker said, that he was nominated by an unconventional president in incoming President Trump. But it seemed like Democrats were focused on his lack of management experience and Republicans were focused on his military experience, having served in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I'm wondering how, what the balance of those two are.
Well, I think you just hit it right on the head, the nail on the head. It is a balance. It's not one or the other. Great to have some military experience. Some secretaries of defense have had much more than Mr. Hegseth. Some secretaries have come from industry and have managed massive organizations. I would say I think the Pentagon is a management job for a Secretary of Defense. You know, nearly $1 trillion in spending, the lives of thousands of people in your hands, the safety of the country. You have to be able to understand where all the pieces are, how the parts move, and when you get recommendations from your people out in the field, be able to balance them and decide what works, what doesn't, what questions you might want to ask that they're not even telling you about, and you want to be able to say to them, what about this, what about that? That's the management challenge.
And Hegseth repeatedly emphasized his own military career and said, look, you know, we've had people running the Pentagon who looked good on paper, but they haven't had that experience that I have, you know, boots on the ground, quite literally. First of all, is that true? And second, how do you think that could add to this job?
Well, the current Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, is a retired four-star general who ran a good chunk of the war in Iraq, also served in Afghanistan, wars that were very problematic, but he was in charge of thousands and thousands of troops and the strategy to move those troops around the battlefield. But I think the one that really comes to mind for me is former Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel, a combat veteran of Vietnam, a man who currently, today, still carries shrapnel in his chest. He's got dust on his boots. He's got real dust on his boots. So having served in war, having served in combat, leading troops, that should be, all respect should be paid to that. But for Mr. Hegseth, I think he's going to very rapidly understand that his job is much more than that. He's going to be in meetings 15 minutes, another 15 minutes, all day long, asking him to make decisions about very complex issues, ranging from artificial intelligence to whether or not to kill the F-35 fighter jet.
I mean, a huge scope, a huge portfolio. It looks like he is going to get through this nomination process, so we will see the challenges ahead. Barbara Starr, great to see you. Thank you so much for your reporting. We appreciate it. And Pam Bondi and her loyalty to President-elect Trump. Can the Attorney General nominee guarantee the Justice Department's independence? Our political panel weighs in next on America Decides. Democratic senators expressed concerns about nominee for Attorney General Pam Bondi's loyalty to Trump at her confirmation hearing today. She promised that under her leadership, the Justice Department will have a, quote, one tier of justice for all. Let's bring in our political panel, Justin Safey and Haima Moore. Justin is a Republican strategist who previously served as a senior advisor for Jeb Bush, and Haima is formerly served as the director for the office of the DNC chair. Big titles, gentlemen. Thank you very much for being here, both of you. So let's talk a little bit about these confirmation hearings. Pam Bondi, you know well from Florida. It seems like she's going to get through the confirmation process, but I'm wondering what stood out to you as you were watching this.
Well, I think she did very well under some pretty hostile questioning from the Democratic senators. And I think, as was mentioned, the big issue that a lot of the Democratic senators for was this issue of loyalty to President Trump. It seemed to be an area of concern. But look, any attorney general is going to be loyal to the president that they serve. I think what she was able to demonstrate, she has a record as the attorney general of Florida for 8 years. She's not an unknown quantity. She's done the job before. And I think that gave a lot of, hopefully gave a lot of senators comfort about the job she'll do.
I mean, Haima, to that point, you did hear a lot of Democrats pressing her on whether she accepted the results of the 2020 election, you know, how she would feel about pardons of January 6th rioters, and kind of if she would essentially do the president's bidding. I'm wondering what you make of the Democrats' argument. Does that land anywhere outside the base?
Look, I mean, I think Justin's right. She's clearly qualified, and she was very poised today. I thought she did a fantastic job. But look, Democrats have got to, this is politics, so they've got to come with a case for something. And I think the Democrats across the board are trying to figure out what's their case against Donald Trump. So I don't think it was about Pam Bondi. She's going to get confirmed, I believe. But they're trying to figure out how do they continue to be the opposition to Donald Trump. They don't want Donald Trump to pardon any January 6 rioters. They don't want to do that. And so I do think it's a fair question for Democrats to ask the Attorney General that. But it's not good politics, I don't think. I mean, I was back home in Louisiana over the break, and all of my family and my friends who are good Democrats, they're sick of talking about January 6th. They're sick of talking about this. They want to move forward. My mom even said, how can we work together to make sure that Donald Trump's successful? And so I think there's some Democrats, you know, the base is, that base, to your point, Justin, earlier, is getting a little bit smaller. But I do think there's some Democrats who are really trying to give Donald Trump a chance and say, how can we come and be more bipartisan?
And this is the conundrum that Democrats have is, most Americans, the election's over, they want the country to succeed, and they want the new administration to succeed in terms of addressing the needs that people have in their daily lives, whether it's public safety, whether it's the economy, whether it's inflation. And I think that's the conundrum that Democrats have, is they want to be the loyal opposition, but the American people want to see people in Washington solve problems for them.
And they're still feeling it. You know, they're still feeling it. Just because there's a new president doesn't mean that the economy's shifted all of a sudden.
Exactly.
You know?
Prices are still high. There's still a lot of concern about the border, obviously. You know, what was interesting to me was watching the Rubio confirmation hearing, because that's where you didn't see really any sparring between Democrats and Republicans. I mean, Justin, obviously being our Florida guy, tell us a little bit about Rubio and kind of the significance of him coming into this position.
Sure. So, you know, President Trump has made a lot of unconventional choices for his cabinet. Senator Rubio is probably the most conventional choice. And there was actually some tension. It was reported in the New York Times and others that there was some tension inside Trump world about whether he should be the nominee for Secretary of State. So I think that he's a former senator. He's respected in the Senate. He's a member of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate. As a Floridian, he's the child of Cuban immigrants, Cuban exiles. So for him, issues like freedom and democracy, anti-communism are very important to him, and America's role in the world. As a senator, he's been very focused on China and America's relationship with China, America's competition with China. So he's very qualified. He'll be confirmed. And I think that this is definitely the most conventional pick that Donald Trump has made in his cabinet.
With this Middle East deal today, with this hostage deal, we saw both sides really working together on this. Jaime, I want you to put your DNC hat back on for just a second, because in a few weeks, we're going to have an election for the new chair of the DNC. But I'm wondering, you know, how much are Democrats really kind of working on a playbook, not just to combat Trump, but to actually get to these issues that people said that they were caring about? Will we see it kind of hashed out through the DNC, or is this kind of more, you know, community driven?
Well, I think you're starting to see it already, Caitlin. I think you and I talked about this a while back. The chairman of the DNC, the role of that position is much different when there's a president of the opposite party. And so the chairman of this party now for the next 4 years has to be the chief opposition and the leader of the party to Donald Trump. Now, while I think Hakeem Jeffries is doing a good job and he is becoming the leader of the party, the DNC chairman is really important. So what you've seen over the last few weeks is you've seen members of this roster of candidates start to talk about what the future of the party looks like, not just opposing Donald Trump, but going back to the roots. How do we go back to labor? How do we go back to Hispanic men in Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, and Florida, and Texas? How do we make sure that we're still bringing on black women and black men in a thoughtful way? And then, of course, this is going to be a big issue coming up. How do we continue to talk about LGBTQ and trans rights that in a thoughtful way that doesn't turn away voters? And so all that's happening already, but over the next 2 weeks, there's a forum tonight that's happening. But over the next 2 weeks, that's going to get much, much more intense. As it stands, you know, Ken Martin from Minnesota, who was on, I think, in CBS just a day or two ago, is leading the pack. Ben Wickler from Wisconsin is right behind him. And then former Governor Martin O'Malley is still in the hunt. Now, that's going to start shifting as the days go on, but it seems like it's still going to be a race between Ben and Ken.
And just quickly, because we're talking about political parties, there is another kind of political party in Florida moving up to Washington. Just quickly, I mean, Susie Wiles, chief of staff, we mentioned Rubio, Bondi, all of these staffers in the White House coming from Florida. What's the significance of that, Florida being kind of the power center?
Yeah, it is, with President Trump being there, and there's a lot of Republicans from Florida. And Florida right now, the economy is good, the crime is low. So I think Florida really is a model for the rest of the country. And so I think that's one of the things that's really important. And if I could just make one quick comment about the Democrats, they're going to have to figure out who they want to be, because the Republicans have made a play for traditional Democratic constituencies. We saw in this last election, younger voters move towards the Republicans, voters of color move towards Republicans, immigrants moving towards Republicans. So the Democratic Party's got a challenge, because the Republican Party is making a lot of inroads with their traditional constituencies. I left out union voters as well.
Which I agree, but look, at some point, I think Republicans are going to have to realize that populism will not always permeate through the entire party. So I'm not sure that's going to hold when the midterms come around.
Plenty to talk about over the next year. We'll take some of that Florida weather, though, on Inauguration Day, especially. Justin and Jaime, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks.
President-elect Trump is about to inherit inflation at a 5-month high. The new numbers, what it means for you, coming up next. You're streaming America Decides. According to the Labor Department, inflation rose more quickly in the final month of 2024. New data finds consumer prices rose 2.9% year over year and 0.4% month over month in December. CBS News Money Watch correspondent Kelly O'Grady joins us now. Kelly, good to see you. So how should Americans be feeling about this report, and what does it mean for the incoming president, President-elect Trump, who promised to bring down prices?
Well, Caitlin, it's great to be with you. So look, my takeaway here is that inflation has ticked up 3 months in a row. This is now a trend. It's not just an anomaly. So that is a bit concerning. And when I dug into the report, there are kind of 3 things that really stood out. The first is that the increases are coming from everyday necessities: energy, food, shelter. These are things that you need to have. It's not a nice to have, especially during winter. You need to heat your home. The second thing is that when the Fed is looking at this data, like I said, it's a trend. This really makes the case that when they meet in 2 weeks and they make that next interest rate decision, it should be a pause. We should not see another rate cut. We already expect them to be more conservative when it comes to rate cuts in 2025, 2 planned versus the original 4. You also mentioned President-elect Trump coming in. A number of his policies have been considered potentially inflationary: tariffs, deportations, cutting the corporate tax rate. So we're really at a very delicate balance. We've got economic growth, we've got a strong labor market, but some of those policies could push that balance out of whack. But of course, we'll have to see what he decides to do come next Monday. Caitlin?
Exactly. A new era indeed. Kelly O'Grady, I always feel smarter after talking to you. Thank you so much. And the backlash is growing against Mayor Karen Bass over her response to the Los Angeles wildfires. More next on America Decides. Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass is facing mounting criticism over her response to the deadly wildfires gripping Southern California. More than 140,000 people have signed a Change.org petition demanding that Bass resign. A lot of focus has been on her decision to travel to Ghana despite fire advisories in LA County. CBS's Jonathan Vigliotti asked Bass about that yesterday.
Looking back, would you have taken that trip overseas?
You know, I am going to focus today on what we know.
For more on this, let's bring in Peter Hamby. He's a founding partner of Puck News and the host of Snapchat's Good Luck America. Peter, great to see you. Thanks so much for being here. I'm glad you and everyone you know so far in LA are doing well and are safe. I think this piece that you wrote about Karen Bass is so fascinating because last week when I saw this video of her getting off the airplane and not responding to a Sky News reporter, just asking for basic comments about anything she could say to the residents of LA. I had to watch it a few times because I was just so struck by her non-response there. I know you've talked to a lot of people in Los Angeles where you are, and you've reported on politics for a long time, and I'm wondering kind of what your assessment is and how people in Los Angeles are feeling about her.
The overriding feeling here in Los Angeles, first and foremost, Caitlin, is people are helping each other. I mean, that has to be said. They're like, if you talk to anyone, I'm in Venice, I have friends who lost houses. Everyone in the city knows not just one, but multiple people who are affected by this in some way. And people are organizing on their own to bring like Zyn to firefighters and find ways to get baby clothes to people who had to flee their houses and lost everything. That being said, Los Angeles County and Los Angeles City, in the years that I've lived here and all the books that I've read, and my in-laws have told me everything they can to try to explain how complicated government and politics is out here, which makes the blame game usually very difficult. We choose to live in this beautiful place. A lot of people that live in Palisades, Altadena, Pasadena, all the way down to Orange County. You live on the coast, but you also live in the hills in a place that's burned for a very long time. The climate crisis has made fires burn faster, harder, longer, more intensely. But Fire is a permanent threat here. And on top of that, you've got many layers of government. You've got the county, you've got the city. Some parts of Los Angeles, where I am in Venice, is part of the city of Los Angeles. Right next to me, Santa Monica, technically can't vote for mayor. And then you've got the Department of Water and Power and commissioners, blah, 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 blah. But Karen Bass, for a variety of reasons, including that video you just mentioned, has come in for singular blame here. It's hard to see politically how she survives this. I mean, there could be a recall here. There's a lot of anger. It requires 15% of the city's voters to sign a recall petition to get that going. But she's up for re-election next year. The big issue, because the mayor of Los Angeles has weaker executive powers than other cities in this country, the one thing you got to do is show leadership and show some sort of political agenda. She knew, we all knew here in Los Angeles from the National Weather Service, on at least by Friday, January 3rd, that there was a real threat here because of the Santa Ana winds and the dry winter, that this could be a calamitous fire situation. The next day, she left. Real quick, though, two big stories just came out in the LA Times that also add to her challenges here. She was at a diplomatic reception in Ghana having cocktails while the Palisades fire was burning. Pictures of that surfaced on LinkedIn. And secondly, the LA Times reported today, and this is probably more of the fire department's issue, although she's in charge of that too, notionally, that they only had 5 trucks in place. Again, no one here was prepared for how dangerous and intense this fire was, so it's hard to point fingers. But Karen Bass is the person that I think if you talk to any random man on the street, woman on the street here in Los Angeles, they'd be mad at her.
Yeah, and there was reporting, too, to that note, that she had pledged during her campaign not to leave the country if she were elected to this position. So the optics and the politics there are, truly something to behold. I'm curious, too. I mean, I love how you mentioned that everyone in Los Angeles and surrounding areas are jumping in to help however they can and are trying to focus on each other and rebuilding their communities. But how much is there a feeling of accountability here, or at least some kind of, steps being taken by those in power like Bass to, do something, or, is there any kind of blame going around for it?
Look, there is, again, I think for her, some of it is unfair. I actually think, and Caitlin, you used the word optics. Again, the city council in Los Angeles, the 15-member city council is, in aggregate, has a lot more power than the mayor. They don't have a ton of power here. But I do think that, there's questions about budget cuts, that reservoir, the Santa Ynez Reservoir near the Palisades that's been written about. There were 117 gallons of water that can go into that reservoir, which has been empty since last February. She's in charge of appointing the executives and the board of governors of the LA Department of Water and Power. But when bad things happen to people, it could be a death in the family, it could be a drug overdose. People tend to want to blame other factors and find somebody to blame. It's not super easy. The blame isn't exclusively on Karen Bass. The blame is on nature and, the way that we live in Los Angeles on the brink of danger at all times. And by the way, a lot of the houses in this city, I think 80-90% of them were built before the year 2000. In Altadena, a lot of old craftsman homes just made for tinder for these fires. And so there's so many fingers you can point to and excuses you can make. It's just that by Karen Bass leaving the country and refusing to say to that Sky News reporter anything to the people of Los Angeles when they were genuinely scared last Tuesday night and Wednesday, that just eliminates trust, and it means that no one is giving her the benefit of the doubt at this point.
Yeah, it seemed just kind of like fundamental elements of, being a leader as well. Well, Peter, thank you so much for your reporting. As I said before, I'm glad you all are safe. Our hearts are with everyone in Los Angeles and hoping that they can get through this and rebuild. But thank you so much.
Thanks, Caitlin.
And that does it for us today. We'll be back with another edition of America Decides tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report starts right now.